Thanks very much, everybody. I was delighted to see the last slide, the last two words on the last slide said good science is really important, so I'm happy. So yes, I've been asked today to talk to you about the role of science in helping for future resilient landscapes in the context of tree health, and hopefully I will succeed in doing that today. I want to divide my talk into three main areas. First of all, touch upon the importance of primary research, the real nuts and bolts of what we do. Move through then into the importance of synthesizing that research, and then finish off with how can science contribute to giving advice and recommendations. Actually, what I want to say as well before I move any further is that much of the work that I'll talk about today is joint between the James Hutton Institute and Forestry Research, so you will see both of our logos and hence the co-authorships as well on the front page. So if I start with primary research, I'm really talking here about looking at the nuts and bolts, as I said. So one example would be the direct impacts of a pathogen on the host species, the presence of resistant genotypes, possible cures, and I put in brackets here the garlic and southern oak death. I presume quite a lot of you saw that last week, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating to see these big trees injected with a garlic solution. But those are the kinds of things that the scientists are all busy beavering away doing all the time, which is underpinning all the stuff that we get to once we actually look at management of sites. So it's really important, all this fundamental primary research. If we then move into looking at wider impacts, again, there's an important role for primary research here. Examples might be, what are the species that are dependent on these trees that are at risk of disease? And that's quite often not thought about. There are a host of species depending on these trees. What about other ecosystem functions which those trees might carry out? For example, their role in nutrient cycling in a forest. Other questions such as, are there good alternative tree species if one particular species is wiped out by one of these pathogens? And thirdly, underneath this topic of primary research, we also have a lot to learn about factors which affect infection and spread. Hugh's talked about global transport of seedlings through nursery stock. We also need to look at the spatial distribution, the condition of the trees, the configuration of the habitats with the landscape. All of these elements of primary research are absolutely fundamental to underpin what we're doing. So I put a little note to myself because I knew I'd forget. Anything that's coloured in red on any of these slides means that I'm going to give you some examples of it. So the ones read there, I'll give you a couple of examples now. So if we start with the first two examples, looking at dependent species and looking at their possible ecosystem function of these trees which are being hit by pathogens, I've given you a very nice glamorous diagram on the top there to show you that ladies in midge-nets measuring trees can look absolutely gorgeous, of course. But there's a good example here, really just to make the point that both looking at species dependent on any of these individual tree species and also looking at their potential ecosystem function requires an absolutely massive amount of work. And if I give one very small example, the species databases that we examined in a contract on ash dieback, for lichens, there are more than 1.2 million individual UK field records on particular lichens growing on particular trees. So they're individual pieces of primary research. And for fungi, there are over 1 million records for the same thing. So that's a huge amount of work which has gone on. And if I take the second topic, ecosystem functions, just for ash alone, we found 420 published field and lab studies on this topic. So again, primary research on this topic, which we actually need. And even then, you're still finding gaps and holes. So a massive, mammoth effort is actually required at that ground level. So if I move on to the second red example, thinking about habitat configuration within the landscape, and this may be of particular interest to all of you in the room here. So the example I've chosen here is just to make the point that there's also an awful lot of spatial data out there nowadays, and it's increasing year by year as techniques improve. We used to traditionally use air photographs, we now use satellite imagery, but all of them require field survey as well, and to do something fancy you require all these skilled spatial modelers. And the example I've given you on the right-hand side here is a question which is actually fairly simple to ask: how connected are our forests at present? So if we're talking about spread of disease, if we're actually talking about spread of desirable species within the landscape, what do we know about the connectivity of our existing woodland resource? So the map on the right there shows current broadleaf woodland in Scotland, which is the little tiny red dots which you can hardly see, and the red and the blue and green lines are the results of modelling effort looking at the surrounding habitats surrounding all of these broadleaf woodlands and looking at how easy it would be for woodland species to move from one woodland area to another within that landscape. So anything that has a green and blue shows a good connectivity, relatively easy for species to move. Anywhere that doesn't shows that it would actually be very hard for species to move. And this is just a generic model, but it gives you a feel for the kind of information we need to know. And of course, there are good and bad implications of this. If we're talking about tree health and pests, we want to know perhaps where the danger zones are in terms of where they might move fastest. But if we're talking about desirable species that we want to be able to allow them to move, then obviously any connection there is something that we want to foster. So again, just touching upon this bigger landscape issue, but it's very important in terms of primary research as well. So if I move on to the second of the three areas, talking about synthesis, well, as you saw, with all of this data, what's absolutely critical before we can really use it is to collate data. And that gives us the ability to say, what is the best possible information that we can tell you about things, but it also says, how confident can we be in making recommendations? And that's often forgotten about. There may be a recommendation made, but there's rarely a tie-in with how many studies was that based on, how reliable were those studies, how confident can we really be that A plus B equals C. So that's the level of confidence is critically important too. And if I give you a couple of examples of some of the good ways of data collation that we need, the first example is where you're actually collating individual studies into something like a searchable database. So in that instance, you can go back to all the original sources very easily on the database. So if you have a particular species that you want to look at, you can drill down into there. But you can also look at the higher level and say, what are the overall conclusions that we can draw from all of the studies that have been done. And I'll give you a few examples from the ASH database, which we developed at the Institute. And the ones in red here that I'll talk to you about in the following slides. First of all would be that we can actually have a look now at what species associated with ash might be at most at risk if the tree declines. And the second one I'll touch upon is, have we got any decent alternative host tree species for all of these species depending on ash, if ash disappears within the landscape? And you can imagine I'm going to give you an ash example, but this would apply for any tree species we choose to study. And the second main way of data collation, which is also really useful, is what we're calling meta-analysis. So gathering together all the published studies that have been done on a particular topic, for example, tree resilience to different pathogens, ecosystem functions of different tree species, I could name many more. And by doing that, we can again get power in quantity of research rather than just dealing with individual studies. We can say, what are the overall big messages from all the research that's been done? But we can then also say, what's the uncertainty? Where are the gaps? Where has very little been done? And again, in terms of synthesis, future projections from that spatial map that I showed you are also really important to look at the speed of spread of these pathogens, the likelihood of resistance developing, the impacts of climate change, and so on, many things which Hugh has also touched upon. So if I give you first an example of what we call the AshEcol database, this is a classic Microsoft Access picture, just to show you how these are all taking place. But the main points I want to make from you are that in collating a database like this, you're basically spelling out, if you have, in the case of this instance, an ash tree, you can gather all the information that's available on what species use ash trees of all different taxa, lichens, plants, birds, whatever you like. And you can look at what parts of the tree they might use, what ages of tree they prefer, what habitat they might live in, how many studies have been done on that, how good are those studies, so therefore what's the confidence, have they been found on any other tree species, if they have, how frequently, is there any evidence for them preferring one species over another, and so on. So you can bring into such a database an enormity of information, and at the end of it get an awful lot of power in terms of what you can look at. But the big message I want to give here, and happily that ties in very much with what Hugh has been telling you, is that at first you can create such a database for lots of tree species, but secondly, and importantly, and tying in with what Hugh has said, it's critically important that we do this now. There's a whole host of diseases. It's great that you gave such a fantastic talk before mine, because you really have a good feel for what we're dealing with now. But as far as we're aware, this is the only such database that has been created for any tree species in the UK, which is pitiful, really. We've got all these diseases which are already here, and we've got all these which are about to arrive. And as far as we know, the only database that actually has collated all the information on species associated with a tree in danger is this one on ash. So we need to do something about this. So let's give you a few examples from the database. Again, bear in mind this is just an example from ash, but it could be done for any tree species and any pathogen. So this is the kind of information that you're getting out. So there are the groups of types of dependent species on the left. So you've got birds, bryophytes, fungi, vertebrates, lichens and mammals. And the numbers which are in that table there show you how strongly associated they are with ash. So if we take high, many of those species are either exclusively or almost always found only on ash. So those would be the danger species if we lost ash within the landscape. And as you go from left to right along the table, you get a decreasing level of association with ash as opposed to with any other tree species. And on the far right, where it says uses, that's where the data doesn't actually distinguish whether it prefers ash or whether it doesn't prefer ash. And there's a lot of data out there that doesn't give you the detail that you need. And at the bottom, the little arrow there says to warn you that, of course, there are many vascular plants and many of the more mobile taxonomic groups, birds and mammals, which may use ash as part of a habitat, but you can't really say they're absolutely dependent on that tree. So there's another thing to consider, is what's the level of dependence on the tree. So a second example from there is then if we think about those numbers and try and ascertain which of those species might be most at risk. Here's another table colour-coded this time, so red is the danger zone, and all the species in there, some 30-odd fungi, 53 invertebrates and so on, are all classified to be most at risk if we lose ash from the landscape. And that takes their conservation status into account as well, their rarity. And you could do the same thing for specific locations, you could do the same thing for different species distributions, presence of alternative host tree species and so on. So this is just an example of what you can interrogate the database for, and then you can basically go and actually have a big push at protecting those individual species if those are the ones that you consider at most at risk and those are the ones you want to protect. So it's a way of coding the level of importance by current designations of conservation status. So to move on to the second red example, let's have a look at a little bit more of these alternative tree species then. So if we have ash, you see on the left-hand side there are a whole other list of possible species that could act as alternative hosts to ash if it disappears from the landscape. So again, using the database, you can assess whether or not they would support the species which are dependent upon ash. And this colour coding just represents that the green ones have the closest association with what ash is. And so these first few columns that I put on at the moment are their role in ecosystem functioning rather than in supporting species. The fourth column, which will appear, will be about supporting species. So if you look at that there, you can see, for example, that alder, the third one on the list, comes out green, green and green in terms of decomposition rate of the litter, the quality of the litter and nutrient cycling, which means that it's very, very similar to ash in its ecosystem function in those particular roles. And so you can go down the list and say, okay, well, if we want to try and make sure that the same ecosystem function that ash is providing at the moment is still being provided, if we have those trees in the woodland, then we should be okay. But then if you add on top of that the column on the right there, that's how many species that are associated with ash are also able to live in association with any of these other tree species. You see that the relative benefits changes. So if you try and assess which tree is best in relation to their ecosystem function or which tree is best in relation to the species which they might support, you don't get the same answer. So again, there are some very difficult questions here that we will have to address if we're trying to actually minimise the detrimental impact of loss of a tree from a landscape. What's the most serious, the species which it's supporting or the ecosystem functions, or do we try to address both, and if so, how do we do it? So the other point I want to make again here, to keep stressing it, is that these are just dependent on available data, and in some cases there are few or no data. So we've got to indicate the confidence levels in all of these data sets, and that's certainly what we're doing in this one. We mustn't lose sight of that. So the third example I want to give you in terms of synthesis, well, site conditions, as we know, and as Hugh mentioned too, are very, very critical for tree health, and trees under stress are more vulnerable to pests and pathogens. Pretty simple. And here's two very nice examples from Duncan Ray and his colleagues in Forest Research, which give you a flavour of the research which they've been carrying on doing from then onwards. These are results of two little tables which are in a very nice Forestry Commission report. And you can see lists of different insect pests on the top little table extract, looking at what different climate changes might do to whether they would increase, whether they would decrease in importance. The little extract of the table below shows a similar kind of thing for disorders and pathogens. So you've got the Phytophthora at the top there. with a prediction about what we think might happen under different climate regimes. So this kind of information is also fundamentally important in terms of it's synthesizing, again, all that primary research into something that we can use to try and make predictions about the severity of any of these pests and diseases in future climate change. So if I stretch that further too to think back about to the wider landscape issues I touched upon before and put them back in the context of climate change, I just want to touch upon something that takes you out of the tree health zone as well for a moment. So you saw this graph before, which was the potential connectivity of our woodland types. If you project this into 2050, which is on the right-hand side here, what's appeared now, which is the brown areas on there, is actually what's predicted to be an increase in prime agricultural land in 50 years from now because of climate change. So this is where I say I'm straying just slightly out of here to show you there's a whole other world that we're not going to talk about today. So if we're talking about trying to look at our woodland connectivity at the moment, and that's dependent on the habitats around the woodlands, if suddenly we get a massive increase in agricultural land in 50 years from now, some of these networks which we thought we were depending on for movement of species will no longer be there. So there are all sorts of other issues that are also changing all the time as we're trying to manage the changes in our forests. So let's move on to the third of my 3 topics. How can scientists then contribute through to advice and recommendations? Well, one thing that we have done, and again, this could be done for other species, is we've made that AshEcol database into a simplified, searchable Excel version, which is now on Natural England's website. So any woodland manager can go there and get any level of information which they want to get very easily. So that's a really good start. It's a way that we can transfer all that huge wealth of knowledge to something that is in fact usable by somebody who doesn't have a huge amount of time, needs answers quickly. A second thing that we can also do is contribute to woodland management guidance for areas which are vulnerable to loss of trees. And examples of that may be what I've touched upon, which tree species might be the best alternative hosts if there's a species of conservation importance dependent on that tree which is being attacked. Another question which again Hugh talked about too, the question of whether tree species mixtures are better than single species. And a third question, can we provide good protocols, again for land managers to try to assess different management methods efficiently and quickly on the ground? And finally, again, we have to keep putting it back into this wider landscape context using spatial modelling analysis, which is so advanced nowadays. There's a huge amount that we can do, and we have to make sure that we keep it in context. So to give you those examples, the first example, thinking about alternative tree species again, what I want to show you here are graphs which are green and grey primarily, and green means that that particular tree species is a good host for a lot of the species which are currently dependent upon ash. So the point I'm trying to make here is if you're assessing individual tree species on the ground and you want to actually say, if ash dies out of my particular forest that I'm managing, have I got other tree species in there that would act as alternative hosts for these trees? This is one of the ways that you can do it. So these 2 examples here, we've got sycamore and we've got hazel. You can see that they're both good hosts for certain groups of ash-associated species, but they're not good hosts for all groups of ash-associated species. So they're both good for bryophytes and lichens, but they're not very good, for example, for fungi and invertebrates that are dependent on ash. So they would only partially solve the problem of how these species are going to survive if ash disappears. A completely contrasting example, almost no green for these 2 conifers, yew and Douglas fir, and as you would expect, there are very few species that are dependent on ash that actually would live very happily in association with conifers. And then finally, the example I want to give you is the best one that we found in terms of having the most similar suite of species that are associated with it is oak. So you could then say from this work that if you have oak in your forest where you have ash, if ash declines or dies out of that forest, a lot of the species currently dependent on the ash trees will probably find an alternative home on the oak trees. So for that one small question, you may be okay. So the second example, what about advice? And back to this question that Hugh raised about are mixtures better than single species? And so what I've got along here is a graph showing you how many species are supported by oak, which is in the blue, and then how many extra species you could potentially support if you added in extra trees into your woodland. So if you're making your, it's almost like your recipe book, which trees do you put in which proportions in your forest, then you could say, okay, oak is supporting about 70% of ash-associated species. If you add in elm, it adds another 10% or so. and so on, going up the level there. So the questions that you could ask then are, do we want all of these species to try to get homes for all of the ash-associated species, or do we only focus on those that are rare and threatened? Or do we actually have a look around at nearby areas which might be connected and have a look at what's there? So there's all sorts of questions that can link to this. This is just basically giving you the numbers about what species will support what. So the question about, are mixtures of species better? Well, yes, if you see a graph like this, of course they're better. They support the greatest number of species. And other research, if we go back to Duncan Ray and his colleagues and the research that Hugh referred to, yes, there's clear evidence that pathogen attack is also generally reduced in mixed forests. So that's another good reason for having mixtures. But we have to remember that site conditions need to be suitable for those species, and we also have to think about the ecosystem function. How important is that? And it's not something that we traditionally tend to think about because it's much more difficult to assess. So to give the second example, what we've also done as part of our ash dieback work is try to create a 5-step process that can again bring the science to something that's usable by a land manager in the most efficient way. So we had a series of study sites across Scotland where we tested out this, and here are the 5 steps that we were proposing. So the first step is assessing the biodiversity of the site. Now, in many sites there aren't species records and there isn't the time to go and do it. So the idea of this is what can you do, what's the best that you can do with a shorter time interval. Some of them have site records, but we also have the NBN database, and there are usually other sources of information. So a desk-based study can be done to say what are the species that are most likely to be in that area. So if we take the case of ash dieback, they'll just be ash-associated species that we're looking for. We can then shortlist from the AshEcol database which of those species are priority species for conservation. If that's what we're wanting to target, then that's what we will target. But one thing I haven't actually set up until now is that I'm of course giving you this from a biodiversity perspective. If you actually wanted to target something else, then you wouldn't necessarily be doing it in this way. So this 5-step process is very much if you're trying to look after the biodiversity that is associated with your target tree species. So the third step then would be to say, okay, again from the AshEcol database, what alternative tree and shrub species could support these ash-associated species that we have on that site? The fourth step would be to go out and say, well, what of those tree and shrub species actually exist on the ground at this site at the moment? And finally, we would then assess the management options. So if I give you a couple of examples of where we have come with those 15 case study sites, if we look at the vulnerable species and alternative trees and shrubs, in terms of species vulnerable to loss of ash, out of all those 15 sites, half of them had more than 50 species which would be vulnerable to loss of ash. So in many cases that's because they're of high conservation importance and they're highly dependent on ash. If we look at the second question, in terms of the status of these alternative trees and shrubs, happily, actually, most of the case study sites already had many of these alternative host species which would support the biodiversity associated with ash. But they were quite often at low abundance. So if you look at the box which says all present, out of 6 of those 8 sites which had all of the species which we've assessed as being good alternatives to ash in terms of hosting the species, 6 of those, they had the species but they were very rare. So are they common enough in the landscape for those species to actually find a home on them sufficiently fast if ash is dying out? So those again are supplementary questions that of course you'd have to ask. But only one site, and they weren't specifically chosen 15 sites, only one site had none of those other tree and shrub species that could support ash-associated species. So that was quite an encouraging message, actually. And then a second example I want to give you from that is this lovely big table. That's all 15 sites. The first column shows what the current management is. The second column shows what we recommended as their management if ash dieback hits their woodland. And we've ordered them in increasing change in site management, so increasing amount of management as you go down the table. And the 2 right-hand columns, the first one with X's in it is whether we think that all they need to do is encourage natural regeneration of some of these alternative host species. And the right-hand column is where we actually think they need to introduce some of these host species if they want to be sure to safeguard those ash-dependent species that are at risk. So again, it just gives you an example of how you can start putting together all of this research and you can try to put it into a form which can actually be used by land managers on the ground to produce something that will help guide what they're actually doing in terms of managing individual sites. So, brings me to my summary, and a tongue-in-cheek but very important message there as that person's eating that tree. As Hugh said, pathogens are absolutely not always predictable, and we have to always be aware of that in all of this stuff that we do. So I can stand here sounding like I'm fairly certain about certain things, but tomorrow something completely different will happen, and we're almost back at square one. We have to be prepared for that to happen. So there's 3 points that I want to leave you with, really. First is that I hope I've shown you that research synthesis can provide what we call the best available information. It can also give us an idea of how confident we are, and importantly, it can identify gaps where we really need to know more. And in my view, this does need to underpin all the management decisions on tree health, future resilient landscapes, any other topic we choose to mention. We do already have powerful analysis tools. We can readily do what I've shown you for ash, for a whole host of other different tree species and pathogens now. And pathogens, as again Hugh said, can have very, very rapid and devastating impacts on our landscapes. And if we wait till there is an impact, and I'm delighted that you said the same message as me here, it's often too late to have much effect. So we need to be doing this now. We need to be collating our information now. We need to be identifying what we know. We need to be acting on that now rather than waiting. Thank you.